Welcome to the audio lecture on the art and culture of Japan before the year 1333. What we're looking at here is a traditional painting in an early Japanese style. Let's look at another one as we begin this exploration of art and culture of early Japan. So what we're looking at here is a painting on silk that uses ink and pigments and some gold also. It was painted right about at the end of the time period that we will be looking at with this audio lecture. There's some really funny things to notice here, and I hope that you can see them in the slide. First, what is that flying in the sky up there? Oh, it's flying Buddhas. So these are aspects of the Buddha that are flying in the sky. But not only that, they're flying in the sky above a shrine dedicated to the Shinto religion. Now, as we look at Shinto, it's good to note that it was not called that until quite a bit later. But the Shinto religion is the early naturalistic belief system that we find in ancient Japan. And in this belief system, the people followed and worshipped what's called the kami. The kami were deities, and they gave and protected life. They embodied the sustainable, cyclical forces that we see all around us in nature. So in this belief system, the kami descended to the earth in beautiful natural places. Places such as mountains, waterfalls, majestic trees, or unusual rock formations. So naturally, these beautiful formations in nature became holy sites in the Shinto religion. Perhaps this is something most people can relate to, that feeling that one gets in nature when you are really in a cathedral, when in a very extraordinary natural place. Now, not only that, these kami, they had messengers on earth. And what were their messengers? The deer that we see all around us here, even in this part of the world. So another interesting thing to note about this particular painting on silk, although it might be a little hard to see, there are some deer down here. There's the natural beauty, the mountains and the trees and the flowers. And then there's this shrine that is recognizable actually as the Kasaga Shrine at Nara, which is right here, seen in an interesting perspective. But above all that, this was never meant to be used as a painting, much as the art that we see in early medieval Japan. This was created to embody religious teachings, to illustrate a point, and it was only later that it was made to be art. Now, this marrying of Buddhism and Shinto was actually a pretty natural union, so to speak, because the practitioners of the Shinto religion, they just believed that the Buddhist deities were embodiments of the kami, and that the energies were very closely aligned. And this melding of these two different belief systems really was pretty strong by around the year 700. And it lasted that way up until the 19th century, when Shinto was declared the state religion in order to support a reverence for the emperor, to create a kind of an emperor worship and thus help the people in power, the emperor, to have absolute control. But anyway, that's enough about that. Let's look at a map, shall we? So let's begin our look at ancient Japan with the beginning of human settlement, which started about 30,000 years ago. These first settlers were Paleolithic, meaning that they were hunter-gatherers and they used stone for tools. Then about 15,000 years ago, they began to farm. And this is always an important adjustment in the life of a people's, because once farming begins, then the people settle into villages and cities, and there starts to be this division of labor. People who farm, people who do not farm, and who support the farmers. Here we have the shoemakers and the bread makers and the architects and all of that that comes with the beginning of farming. Now, the earliest known Neolithic culture is called the Jomon culture, and they were early potters. In fact, some of the oldest ceramics ever found were found in Japan, dating to about 10,000 BC. Following the Jomon people were what we call the Yayoi, and they started in about 400 BC to cultivate rice. Rice came in from Korean influences. Now, once the cultivation of rice started, then there was a class structure and a further division of the society into a structural form. So, and then there was the leaders, was the beginning of the imperial system, as certain leaders were elevated. Another thing that the Koreans brought to Japan around this time was metallurgy, the ability to work with metals, and thus to make tools that would further serve their farming. Next up in our quick run through prehistoric Japan is what we call the Kofun period, and that's beginning about 300 AD. This is when we have the beginning of a centralized government and a more complex social order, more outright veneration of the leaders. The term Kofun actually means old tombs, and these peoples built elaborate, complex tomb sites modeled after Korean and Chinese examples. Now, by order of the Japanese government, these tomb sites have never been excavated, but they can cover up to 400 acres. And in these, they would make high mounds, these sort of man-made hills, and this would be over the tomb where the people were actually buried in these tomb complexes. And on top of these little hillocks would be these things, which are called hanawa. And these are these ceramic figures that are built over a cone, and maybe they would let the spirit out. What we see here really kind of tells us a lot about the Japanese aesthetic that we'll see repeated over and over. It's not rigidly symmetrical. One arm is a little bit bigger than the other. The eye slits are not exactly perfect. And there's really not a focus on an external sheen. It maintains its simple earthenware luster. And yet it has a very nice simplicity to it also. So these are the hanawa, and they were placed over the tops of tombs. Another thing that we see in the Kofun period is a highly evolved ceramics practice coming into play. And what this means is that the earlier ceramics were burned in a bonfire to fire them. But then as they developed the ability to regulate the heat more in kilns, then they could create high fire ceramics with the lustrous finish that we see in both Korean and Chinese ceramics. So now let's talk for a moment about Shinto, the native religion of Japan. This indigenous belief system centers around a variety of religious practices, really, but they all center around family, village community, devotion to the kami, and thus a devotion to natural spaces and a natural harmony in the world. The term Shinto, as I said earlier, really only came into use when Buddhism was introduced into Japan around the year 600. As Buddhism was integrated into the kami worship, the rituals became more systematized within Shinto, and shrines were built as well as a spiritual hierarchy being created. What we're looking at here is a Shinto shrine called the Grand Shrine of Ise. It's on the coast southwest of Tokyo. Now this shrine is dedicated to the sun goddess, and she's the legendary matriarch of Japan's imperial family. So one thing that's very interesting about this shrine, there are written records that date it back to the year 100 AD. What we know for sure is that at least since the year 690, it has been dismantled and rebuilt every 20 years. And this has happened up to this day. And another thing about it is that the compound at Ise is visited by millions of pilgrims every year. But this inner shrine, the inner sanctum, so to speak, was forbidden. The only people that have been allowed to see this, to view this shrine, have been members of the imperial family and some very high Shinto priests. Well, in the year 1953, a photographer was given rare access, and he shot this picture. Actually, if you look at the timing, it was right after it was rebuilt as part of this 20-year cycle. Now, this rebuilding, dismantling, and rebuilding again is really expressive of a fundamental tenet of the Shinto belief system, which is that nature does this. We as humans, nature as nature, is constantly breaking down and rebuilding, disassembling, rebuilding. We have winter, then we have the rebirth of spring. So that is ritually expressed in this structure. The people who do this are carpenters that are trained since early childhood to take it down in a very specific way. It makes me think of the tea ceremony of Japan, where every aspect of it is done with complete attention. Beginning around the year 552, there's 100 years of development in the history of medieval Japan that very much reminds me of the Renaissance in Europe, because during this time there was unparalleled advances in really all aspects of culture, including philosophy, medicine, food, music, clothing, agriculture, city planning, religion, visual art, and architecture. In particular, advances in Buddhism, centralized government, and the development of writing. And each of these was modified to suit the Japanese way of life. Now, once we have the advent of writing, which happened, long about 600 AD, then the culture is no longer prehistoric because they can then write down their history. Now, Buddhism first arrived in this time, in around the year 600, and it came in the Mahayana form. And in this form, there's many deities and levels of bodhisattvas. Now, later, Zen Buddhism or Chan Buddhism was really prevalent in Japan. But back in these early days, this Mahayana form of Buddhism was adopted as the state religion. And it's actually very different from the Shinto practices in its expression, because the Buddhas are anthropomorphic. In other words, they're depicted as human-like. And the kami, these legendary figures from Shinto, they were never depicted in any kind of human form. Also, when Buddhism came to Japan, it opened the door really to the Asian continent, so that many other highly developed aspects of the culture and art came with it. Here we're looking at the oldest wooden building known in the world. And it's the shrine at Horyuji. It's the shrine at Horyuji. And it was built by Prince Shotoku. He was a powerful ruler, and he was really one of the main proponents of Buddhism. He first had it built in around the year 609, but then it burned, as do wooden buildings. So it was rebuilt in the year 670, and it continues to be used and is considered a national treasure. It's used to this day. Let's look briefly at some of the design elements that we see here. This is a 5-story pagoda. It's not entered. It's really like a large-scale sculpture, and it's a reliquary, so it houses important sacred artifacts to the religion. And on this side, we have the meeting hall where people can actually gather within the inner compound. And then out on the exterior, there's monks' quarters and a lecture hall and other buildings that support this inner sanctum. So this is really the oldest Buddhist compound that we know of in Japan, and it's really one of the oldest wooden buildings that survives in the world to this day. I love the way that they have all these subtle design elements. Like, notice how this roof line, it subtly has a dip to it. That's something that we see over and over in Japanese architecture. Here's one of the panels that we see on the side of the shrine at Horyuji. And this is a very interesting scene from the Jataka tales, which are the tales of the previous lives of the Buddha. So what you're seeing here is that the Buddha has decided to sacrifice his life in order to feed 2 hungry tigers below. But they are too weak to attack and kill him. So what he does, there's many panels in this one painting. Here's the first panel. He takes off his shirt and he hangs it on a tree. And then he dives down to kill himself, dives off the cliff, and finally his body is given to give life to the hungry tigers. So this is actually one of the very few paintings that have survived from the Asuka period, and so is really a treasure. Hard as it is to see here, it's a beautiful piece of work. And one more image from Horyuji. This one is made by Tori Bushi, and the term Bushi means sculptor. So he is probably descendant from Korean sculptors. It means sculptor in Korean. But what we see here is a Buddha flanked by bodhisattvas. And remember, the bodhisattvas are the deities that live on earth and wait enlightenment in order to bring enlightenment to others. We see these on the outside. In the center, we have the Buddha, who is much more simply dressed and represents that aspect of presence in the stories of the Buddha. The thing to note here is that, first off, this is a really beautifully done early bronze, but also that it really reflects a Chinese aesthetic. We're seeing strong influence of the Chinese design sensibilities with this piece. So as one looks at Buddhist art from around the world, there are certain symbols that we see repeated over and over again, and they have specific meaning. First, let's go to the lotus flower. And that's at the upper left here. That one is typically depicted as a white water lily. And I don't know if you've seen lotus flowers in bloom, but they're really beautiful and they're quite striking. And they rise up above the water on these stems, so that here would be the water level, and then the stem rises up above it. They represent spiritual purity, the wholeness of creation, and a certain cosmic harmony. The stem represents the axis mundi, which is sort of the pole at the center of the world. This is something that we've seen in the Buddhist architecture in Southeast Asia also. Now, the Buddha is often sitting on a throne of either a lotus flower or a double lotus flower, which is what we see in the second illustration right here. And that simply means if he's sitting upon the lotus flower, he's achieved nirvana, or a profound enlightenment. The next symbol that we have here is a chakra, or a wheel of life. Now, this one holds a particular interest for me as we look at the parallels throughout the world. And the notion of a center, or a spiritual center, represented by the chakra, is seen in everywhere from the traditional Hawaiian belief practice, to the teachings of Rudolf Steiner in Europe, to the Buddhas, to the yogis, and on and on. So it's an interesting concept to explore. The best known, you could think of the third eye, or the center of the throat, or the heart. And even though these aren't organs that we can see, many people do believe that these are spiritual organs, which is sort of interesting, especially since it's all over the world. All right, so the Buddha, moving on, has marks. He has this bump at the top of his head, which is called a Ushnisha, and this represents his enlightenment. And what they call a tuft of hair in the middle of his forehead, I've also seen it often as just a circle. It's called a Uma, and that again represents his spiritual connection. The elongated earlobes are something that we also see quite often, as well as on his feet, a 1,000-spoked chakra. Now, according to this particular belief system, the number of spokes on the chakra really denote what it actually means. And this is something that we see variations of as this wheel of life is represented throughout the world. Another thing that we see often in the Buddhist art is a mandala. And a mandala is a circle that is originally, it was created to be a focal point, a place of study during meditation and contemplation. And we're going to look at an ancient Japanese mandala in a moment, but you can find mandalas both ancient and modern in such a variety of depictions, and they're often really interesting to study. I know in Tibetan Buddhism, what they have is many levels of teachings that are hidden within the mandala. As the Asuka period ended, what we'll call the Japanese Renaissance, there was the beginning of what we call the Nara period. And what distinguishes this most is that it marked the end of the moving of the capital city each time an emperor died. So prior to this time, every time an emperor was deceased, the city would move to a new location as a sort of a ritual purification, getting rid of all that old energy of that old emperor, so to speak. Now, this was also probably a pretty smart political move because they would then be able to start fresh politically. So as the capital was developed in Nara, it became quite a large city. And the emperors who ruled the city were very devout Buddhists. One of them actually abdicated the throne in 749 in order to become a monk. So during this time period, they had elaborate Buddhist and Shinto festivals. There was a huge one long about the middle of the 8th century, around 750. And during this time, goods were imported from China. Special things were made in Japan in order to celebrate the unveiling of a new statue in this new temple complex. One of the items that has survived from that time is the rare 5-stringed lute. This, as you can see, is elaborately decorated and inlaid, but one of the things that is most striking about it, if you look closely, is that the figure represented is of Central Asian descent, not a Japanese or a Chinese. Now, this is actually a Chinese instrument that was imported to Japan, and while we know that we don't know exactly where it was made, we do know that it was played, so not just an ornamental instrument. It was used to bring great joy to all who listened to it. So, on the note of great music, let's stop now and we'll continue with part 2. Thanks for listening.